Well, all right, heroes, coming to the microphone. It is I, your friendly neighborhood rabbi, John Carrier. It is an evening. It's about 8:30 in the evening. Sorry, a little bit flustered. Got the kids to myself this week, and so getting everybody down for bedtime, things like that, a little more challenging than normal. And I'm having a rotten hair day, hence the baseball cap. I do like my head to be covered from time to time, but nowadays. If I had my hair out, you could barely see my kippah. It'd be so crazy right now. Anyway, I'm excited to talk to you about this topic, and this is going to be a little more Q&A-y, a little bit less lecture-y, just because this is going to be a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I hope it's going to be more of an open conversation. I'll share with you a little bit of my story. Our topic tonight, in case you didn't know, is interfaith marriage, and this is something that I have personal experience with, being interfaith married at one point myself. And so I have a lot to say about the subject from somebody who has experienced that, but also I have something to say about the subject as a rabbi who has since counseled and been the rabbi for interfaith families. And when I say interfaith, I mean a family where one partner is Jewish, one partner is not. Could be somebody who grew up Christian, could be somebody who grew up with no religious background whatsoever, not quite ready to be Jewish. But this is more and more common. And I'll acknowledge that in the past, the Jewish community's way of dealing with these interfaith relationships was to shun them. And I'm not proud of that. It's just how it was. If a lot of the model comes from something like, let's say, Fiddler on the Roof, where one of the daughters of Tevye the milkman falls in love with somebody nearby in the village or in the nearby area who is not Jewish, and the family just disavows her, just completely doesn't acknowledge her at all. There is a custom of families, sitting Shiva for a child who marries someone outside the faith, and Shiva is normally reserved for mourning. So they're treating someone who married somebody who's not Jewish as like a dead person, like you're not even in the world anymore. And that reality does not fit with most of the communities that I've been involved with, including my own family at one point. So I'm sorry if I'm starting to rant right away, but this is a personal topic and a topic that engenders a lot of emotion. Nevertheless, this is something that families live with all the time, and I want to give the best advice that I can, answer any questions that people have, give tips from my own personal experience, and also my experience as a rabbi helping families like this thrive as happy Jewish families. And so real quick, I'm going to go to the chat, see who's online already of the Jew curious people. I don't see anybody quite yet, so I'm just going to say, oh, there. No sooner did I speak than I see Teresa from Cyprus. I see Kathy from the beach in California. I see my friend Ruthie is here, so I'm just going to say hi to everybody in the chat. Hi, everybody. What questions do you have? And if we really get this discussion going, then this is a live studio recording, if you will, for the Jew Curious Show podcast. If you're a listener to that podcast, you may have noticed lately that we've done a new kind of podcast where we used to just have interviews. Lately, we have recordings of these live Q&A sessions. And so I would love it if people would ask what questions they have so that people who listen to that podcast who have questions about this situation, this kind of family that they may be in or may be contemplating, can get those questions answered on the Jew Curious Show podcast. Again, been kind of a rough day. Just going to hit the rocket fuel pretty hard. Hold on one sec. All right. So I'm going to encourage anybody who is in the chat right now to ask what questions they have about how to be present in an interfaith family. What questions do they have about interfaith families that they know? What's the right way to interact with these families? And while some questions are formulating, I'm just going to share my story, okay? And the context of the communities that I've been involved with in my 20 years being involved in the Jewish community, let's say. 23 or so, I'll say. So here's my story. I didn't grow up Jewish. If you've watched any of these live channel episodes or listened to the Jew Curious Show podcast, you probably already know that. I grew up sort of mixed Protestant. I'll say by the time I was in college, I was a devout atheist, and I say devout advisedly. Atheism is a kind of religion because it has a certain certainty and faith involved in it. And then I met a Jewish girl in college, and we hit it off. And long story short, we decided to get married, and then we decided to start a family. And when we were getting married, my then fiance said to me, I don't expect you to convert to Judaism. That's an entirely personal choice on your part. However, I feel strongly, she said, that any children that we have should be raised Jewish. And I had to think about that because, again, I didn't feel connected to any religion. But I decided that it's good for kids to have a thing. It's good for kids to have a tribe. It's good for kids to have a village. And she felt more strongly about her village than I felt about my village when it came to things like faith and a religious and cultural tradition. And so I said, okay, but I had no intention to convert to Judaism, and I didn't convert before we got married. I did convert later. Don't worry, the rabbi is legit. Like I converted to long day. Converted to Judaism about, let's say, 19 years ago this summer. I've been a rabbi for about 4.5 years now. I didn't plan to be a rabbi when I converted. Just that's another story. But for several years after we got married, before I converted, I was in an interfaith family. She grew up in a conservative Jewish congregation, and we took it for granted. I don't think we even asked whether the rabbi there would marry us, and we just took it for granted that he would not. Conservative rabbis, for the most part, will not officiate a marriage between a Jewish person and somebody who's not Jewish. But we did find a rabbi who would, and it wasn't the rabbi in her family. Again, I didn't feel sore about that. We just kind of knew that was the game. And I will say, I will be upfront and transparent about this. I'm a conservative rabbi or a Masorti rabbi, depending on what kind of label you want to use. Positive historical school of Judaism. That's the tradition that I'm a part of. And as a part of that tradition, I myself won't officiate at marriages between a Jewish person and somebody who's not Jewish. I'll marry any couple, regardless of gender or orientation, as long as both of them are Jewish. But that's the extent of it. And so you may think that's a little bit hypocritical, but that's a story for another time. In any case, at the time I got married, I was not Jewish, and my affianced was. And so for several years, I was a part of an interfaith marriage. So I know what I'm talking about. This isn't just a projection of my own imagination. I know what it's like to be in a relationship like this. Later, after our kids were a little bit older and asking questions and things like that, I decided to take a class about Judaism. I took a class about Judaism for about a year, and at the end of that, after much deliberation, I decided to convert. So we then became I'll say a nominal Jewish family with 2 Jewish parents. Later on, we divorced, and I then fell in love with somebody a couple of years later who was not Jewish, and I made the same deal with her. I said, look, I'm Jewish. I don't expect you to be. I want to get married no matter what. But I'd like you to take the class because I have 2 kids who are Jewish and I'm raising them as such. And so I'd like you to know our context. And she took the class and she wound up converting before we got married. And so I have, all this is to say, I have experience in interfaith relationships and interfaith marriage. Later on, I became a rabbi, and a rabbi in a community that had a lot of interfaith families in it. And they would come to my office and they'd say, how do we figure out Christmas with grandparents? How do we raise a child Jewish while still respecting the tradition of the other parent? And so tonight, I'm not going to tell you what to do necessarily. Just I want to share some of that experience with you and answer what questions you have about this important topic that affects a lot of Jewish families in our communities. And I say Jewish families with intention because, in my experience, a family with a Jewish parent is a Jewish family trying to figure out how to be the best family that they can be. So, thank you for that. I'm going to go into the chat and see what's going on here. Are interfaith marriages accepted in the conservative movement? Is it true that it's still not accepted in the Orthodox community? So that's, boy, that goes right to the heart of the matter. Let's see. Will all rabbis help you convert if it creates an interfaith family? That's an excellent question, one that I personally deal with all the time. The Orthodox do not recognize conservative conversion, only theirs. That's a good point, Teresa. And so let me go right to the heart of this. And again, I'm going to go to a personal experience of mine. As my oldest son was going through synagogue preschool, now he's a grown man. He's about to get married later this year. So this is way back in the day. I'm watching him grow up. I'm not Jewish. His mother is. He's a part of. We are a part of a synagogue community. He is a part of a synagogue preschool. And I looked at him and I saw this is a kid who is, God willing, going to have a bar mitzvah one day. And part of the, I'll admit it, pressure on me was that in that time and place, let's say for almost 20 years ago, conservative congregations didn't go the extra mile to include non-Jewish spouses as a part of the community. The general rule for many, many years was that if somebody married somebody who wasn't Jewish and they were a part of the synagogue, the membership roll, like as in roll call, would count the Jewish person as a member, but not the non-Jewish spouse, to the extent that when the synagogue sent mail to that household, the letter would only have the name of the Jewish partner on there. It would not acknowledge the non-Jewish spouse at all. When B'nai Mitzvah were celebrated, then likely the Jewish parent could be a part of the ceremony, a part of the service, could get an aliyah, could be on the bima, could help pass the Torah from one generation to another, for example. But in many places, the non-Jewish parent was totally excluded from the proceedings. Now, this wasn't everywhere. This hasn't been for all time, and that's changed a lot in the intervening 20 years. And I'm pretty happy about that personally. But at the time, I was looking at raising a child who would come of age in the Jewish community, and I would be entirely excluded from that ceremony, much less his Jewish upbringing not being very knowledgeable. And so I'm going to admit that was part of my incentive for studying Judaism and later becoming Jewish, was so that I could take part in his significant life cycle events. That has changed quite a bit in the conservative movement, at least. In the Reform movement, I'll say, just by anecdote and observation, I haven't been a part of the Reform movement, but in the Reform movement, the non-Jewish spouse has been permitted to have a more active role in synagogues, in even being a member or an officer of the board of synagogues for several years now. I will say that in the last few years, more and more synagogues in the conservative movement have created space for the non-Jewish partner. They've stopped doing that thing where they only put the Jewish partner on the mailing labels, and now they include the entire family in membership. More and more conservative synagogues are allowing non-Jewish spouses to have all the rights and privileges of complete membership in the synagogue. More and more synagogues are allowing non-Jewish spouses of a Jewish person to serve on the board and significant committees of the synagogue and its governance structure. There are certain lines to be drawn, like ritual committee being the president of the synagogue, for example. But more and more conservative synagogues are being more and more accepting of non-Jewish spouses in an interfaith marriage. So that's going directly to this question. Are they accepted in the conservative movement? So on the one hand, conservative rabbis, by and large, are forbidden from officiating a marriage between a Jewish person and a person who's not Jewish, in the sense that we can get kicked out of the union, as it were. We have a they hate when we use the word union, but there's something called the rabbinical assembly that all conservative rabbis are a part of, and one of the major rules is we don't do intermarriages, and if we do, we can be censured, we can be removed from the rabbinical assembly, etc. So for the most part, conservative rabbis won't perform these marriages. However, that doesn't mean that we won't serve as a rabbi to this family that is a part of our congregation, right? We know the couple before they get married. We know and serve the couple after they get married. We just don't do those weddings. And now there are cases sometimes of conservative rabbis performing those marriages. Again, I'm not personally there yet, but it happens. And so, again, in the Reform movement, it's been happening for some time. In the conservative movement, we are, thank God, finally warming up to these families. And I say thank God because I am the Jew that I am today and the rabbi that I am today because I had a warmer, more open experience with conservative rabbis before I was Jewish and certainly since. So that's the change that's happening. By and large, Orthodox communities are not as open to, let's say, recognizing the union of a Jewish person and a not Jewish person, officiating that kind of marriage, accepting that kind of family as members of their synagogue. And so, it just all kind of falls on a spectrum. Let's see what kind of other questions we have. Will all rabbis help you convert if it creates an interfaith family? This is a good question because this is a question that I encounter all the time as a conservative rabbi who sponsors people for conversion and sits on a Beit Din. And so there's this notion that is it possible to convert someone who's married to somebody who's not Jewish, or they're not Jewish because they're converting, they're married to somebody who's not Jewish, and that other person has no intention of converting, and so, but they're married, and so by converting the one person, you're in effect creating an intermarriage. And some rabbis just, as a rule, will not do this. Some rabbis, nobody as a rule will, but this actually came up in a discussion of rabbis that I was a part of recently, kind of an online discussion with lots of rabbis involved. And it sort of split 50-50. Some rabbis just wouldn't do it at all. And these were all conservative rabbis. Some rabbis wouldn't do it at all. And some rabbis would take it on a case-by-case basis. That is, if you're working with someone who is sincere about becoming Jewish and their spouse is sincere about not becoming Jewish, is that spouse supportive of the conversion candidate's journey, or is this going to create a problem in their family? And this is just me personally, I'm of the position that I take it on a case-by-case basis. So if I'm working with someone and they want to be Jewish, their spouse does not want to be Jewish, but I'll ask them the question, like, is your spouse actively opposed to you becoming Jewish? Are they going to help you on your journey, or are they going to be are they going to pull you back? Is this actually going to create friction in your marriage? And I will say I've worked with a number of candidates for whom their spouse, while not wanting to become Jewish, was totally supportive of the idea. Actually encouraged them. Their spouse saw what becoming Jewish meant to them, what a positive thing it was in their life. They weren't ready to take that step yet, but they totally supported their spouse taking that step. And I have participated in conversions in that sort of circumstance. I've sponsored people for conversion in that circumstance. And I'll tell you, not that this was the goal or anything, but probably as often as not, that spouse that didn't want to become Jewish saw what being Jewish meant for their now Jewish spouse, and then later converted themselves. And so, for me, this is the crux of the matter. Do we shun families? Do we turn people away in order to prevent intermarriages from occurring at all? Or are we open and are we lenient so that more people can become Jewish, and then showing people how open we can be and showing people how great it can be to be Jewish, do we actually attract more converts than we started with? And so, speaking a little off book, not all of my colleagues agree with me on this, but I have been the benefit of other rabbis' openness, and so I try to pay that forward with an openness in my own right. I still have standards. I still have criteria for sincerity, for knowledgeable solidarity among conversion candidates, but I would rather welcome in the convert with a spouse who is supportive than completely dismiss someone just because their spouse didn't want to be Jewish as well. I don't know if that answers your question. I will say again, it's a spectrum to this day as to what different rabbis will do. Again, in the Reform movement, it's not so divided in that sense. And in the Orthodox movement, it's also very not divided because for the most part, they don't do conversions of a person whose spouse does not want to convert. So I hope that answers your question, Val. Let's see what other questions we have here. Is it acceptable, this is again Val, is it acceptable for the Jewish parent to do all of the religious education experience holidays if the non-Jewish parent is not interested? And so I'm going to take you kind of at face value about not interested versus actively adversarial. Of course, it's appropriate for a Jewish person to teach Judaism, to perform mitzvot, to demonstrate different rituals of holidays. And if the non-Jewish spouse doesn't want to participate in that necessarily, then somebody's got to. So it's totally okay. And I want to take a pause here for a second. I recently had a conversation with Rabbi Adam Greenwald, talking about the difference between families with, let's say, one Jewish parent and families with two Jewish parents. And we agreed that families with two Jewish parents can be just as diverse, meaning different approaches to Judaism, different levels of observance, things like that, as a family with one Jewish parent and one not Jewish parent. I've seen families where they have one Jewish parent and the non-Jewish parent was totally supportive of celebrating all the holidays and rituals and things like that. And I've seen Jewish parents where one had a different background, the other had another background, and they were less cooperative in how they did holidays and things like that. So I don't want to paint the picture that a household with two Jewish parents is always perfect, is always ideal, is always on the same page, any more than a household with one Jewish parent and one parent who's not Jewish. So it's totally acceptable for the Jewish parent to do everything if the other parent is not interested. Hopefully, I like to see that the not Jewish parent is at least cooperative and supportive and doesn't actively work against what's going on in the household. Let's see what other questions people have. Just going to take another sip of the rocket fuel here. So I really appreciate the great questions that people have. I want to go back to the general idea that this is more and more common. The old way of dealing with it among movements that were less open to interfaith marriages was to either ignore it altogether or to shun families who had interfaith marriages. And because that's been so hurtful and not successful in retaining the family in the congregation, you see more and more congregations in the, I'll say, more conservative movements of Judaism being open to these families. They have, different standards for whether they'll do the marriages or things like that. But the more open we have become, the more we have helped these families thrive as Jewish families, where we see both partners get involved in the community, the kids have a strong Jewish identity, and the more open we are, the more helpful we are, I think the more successful we are at helping them thrive as Jewish families. That's something that it's of utmost importance for me to get across tonight. Let's see. Kay asks, if my non-Jewish daughter has children, can the kids be Jewish because they have a Jewish convert grandma? So thank you for that, Kay. I'll just say, I hate to give short answers, but the answer is, generally speaking, at least according to Jewish law, no. The Jewishness in the Orthodox movement and in the conservative movement, and according to the traditional read of Jewish law, goes through the mother directly, so that if a grandmother converts, it doesn't confer Jewish status upon her daughter unless the daughter converts. And so the children wouldn't be halachically, or according to Jewish law, as observed by conservative and Orthodox Jews, the kids wouldn't be Jewish if they didn't have at least one Jewish parent. And I think in the Reform movement as well, if the kids don't have at least one Jewish parent, the kids can be raised with Jewish culture, etc., but to be considered officially Jewish, they would either need at least one Jewish parent by the Reform movement or a Jewish mother by conservative and Orthodox and other traditional reads of the text. But they can convert. Like anybody can convert according to the standards of the community that they are a part of. But you can encourage them to do that. And it's way easier for kids to convert, for example, than for adults to. But thank you for the question. So let me throw in a pro tip, if I can. How do these families, and I say these families, having been a part of one, how do these families thrive as Jewish families? The number one pro tip is mutual respect, right? You don't have to necessarily agree on what religion each person is. I do think it's nice when people get married if they have some sort of baseline agreement on the most important things in life. But I recognize the reality that in America today, religious adherence is an individual choice, much more so than it has been throughout history, and much more so than it has been true for Judaism, which has, for the most part, been as much about peoplehood as it has been about religion. However, in the United States of America today and in other liberal cultures, religion is considered a choice of the individual. And if that's the case, then as long as those individuals who are parents of the family have a kind of mutual respect, mutual regard for one another, that is key to having a successful interfaith marriage and a successful interfaith family, right? You don't have to be the same thing. You just can't be actively working against each other. If you're sort of dueling religions or dueling holidays, that can be a very difficult context to have a successful marriage, to have a healthy, thriving family. So the baseline is mutual respect. What I'll add to that, and this is, pro tip number 2, is mutual learning. I highly recommend that if two people are in a marriage, and all the more so if they have kids in that marriage, then they take the time to learn about each other's traditions, even if it doesn't end in conversion, or even if it doesn't end in, kind of homogeneity of the family's religious practice. They should at least, out of mutual respect, be willing to learn the other partner's tradition. This is kind of how I went about it. I wasn't intending to be Jewish when I took an introduction to Judaism class. I just wanted to learn about the faith of, let's say, the rest of my family. And later on, when I was about to be married again, I didn't expect my spouse to, or my fiance to convert. I just wanted her to learn about my tradition. And, I probably didn't learn as much as I should have about her tradition. But I really encourage families today to learn about each other's thing. And for example, I have a couple in my Introduction to Judaism class now here in the LA area where the couples they're sort of taking two classes. Like it's a Jewish person and a Catholic person, and the Catholic person, or both of them rather, are sitting in on the Introduction to Judaism class, and then both of them are sitting into the class about Catholicism, so that each of them can learn about the other's tradition of upbringing. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's a show not only of mutual respect, but mutual curiosity and getting to know each other by getting to know each other's background. So I think you need to start with mutual respect, and you need to, I guess, where the rubber meets the road, really take that to the next level and have mutual learning. Let's see, I've seen another thing pop up here. If a parent converts with her children under 12, do the children under 12 need to convert as well? And so I'll say, according to traditional Jewish law, I'll make a more extreme example here. Let's say a woman is converting and she is pregnant. And so that's not the question you asked, but we'll start from there because that's about as young as children can be. And so if a woman converts and she's pregnant before the children are born, she converts before the children are born. In Judaism, life or personal identity begins at birth, and that means that a person who becomes Jewish before the children are born, the children who are born or after the conversion are Jewish. Beyond that, if the children are living, breathing human beings with names and faces and identities, the children need to convert as well, from, let's say, age 0 to whenever. And so if somebody's converting and already has children and wants to raise their children as Jews, or wants their children to be considered Jewish in the Jewish community they're a part of, the children will need to convert as well. But this raises another question. What's that conversion like? Now, for children, it's different from somebody converting as an adult. Generally speaking, when a child converts before the age of legal majority, that is bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah, 12 for girls, 13 for boys, then it's a slightly different process in the sense that the child still needs to go to the mikveh. The Beit Din just doesn't ask as many questions, I'll put it that way. So I have a circumstance right now where I have a mother and a daughter who are converting together at the same time. And the mother is going to go to the Beit Din, and we're going to ask her questions for about 30, 40 minutes or however long that conversation takes to discern if this adult has, studied enough and is sincere and really can make that decision with full knowledge of her own free will to become Jewish. And so there is a Beit Din, I hate to use this word, sort of interrogation involved. And then she goes to the mikveh. However, her child, who is not yet 12, will not have that same level of interrogation because she's sort of considered under the jurisdiction of her parent before she becomes an adult in Jewish law. And so before that age of legal majority, again, 12 for girls, 13 for boys, the parent can essentially bypass the Beit Din and say, okay, she's going to become Jewish. Now, the Beit Din might ask the child questions anyways. Like if the kid's like 0 years old, like a baby, this happens a lot with adoptions and things like that. We don't ask the kid questions. When they're babies, they give terrible answers anyway. So, we don't ask the kids a lot of questions. If they're 11 or if they're 12, if they really have become, conscious thinking beings, we'll say, hey, do you like being Jewish? Because they've been raised in a Jewish household their whole life. Do you want to keep being Jewish? That's fine. And then they go to the mikveh. And so there's a different, slightly different process, not as much question asking involved, but the mikveh is the same. And so the kids still have to go to the mikveh. And then if someone converts before the age of bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, the general rule is that once they become bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, they can revoke their conversion. They could say, no, this was done, now I'm a Jewish adult. This was done against my will, under duress, what have you. I disavow the whole thing. However, if a child converts and upon becoming bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah decides to keep being Jewish, they don't have to do anything additional beyond that. It just sort of, I don't know, grandfathers in, or just sort of by default, they remain Jewish. And again, this happens a lot with families who adopt a baby, through adoption or surrogacy or something like that. I'm at the mikvah all the time with families with little babies, which weren't born into their family, but became part of their family as infants, and they are converted as infants. And if the child then, upon reaching the legal adult age according to Jewish law, decides to cast it off, they can. But if they don't do anything about it, they're just sort of considered Jewish. And so, long story short, a mother who converts with children who are out of her body, those children will need to go through a conversion as well. So let's see. She will have to study and do the same as me, since she will most likely be 12 when we convert. I'm going to say a kid who's kind of 12 and on the bubble, you ask your local rabbi for particular circumstances. It's not like the day before she's 12, it's easy. The day after she's 12, it's just like as if she were an adult. This is a very special and rare circumstance. So I would consult with the rabbis who are on the Beit Din. They're not going to ask her, the same kind of questions they would ask an adult. It'll vary somewhat. So it's kind of a gray area. So I'll say consult your local authorities. Ask me. It'll be fine. So I'll just put it that way. Let's see what other questions we have here. I was asking because my daughter's 11. Okay. So these are great questions that are coming up. One thing I want to make sure we talk about tonight in this context is what rabbis call the December dilemma. What happens in an interfaith family in December, where one spouse traditionally celebrates Christmas and one spouse traditionally does not, so celebrates Hanukkah or something else. And this can be challenging, right? And this can be challenging in Jewish households. I just had a rabbi on my podcast, on the Jew Curious show, talking about his Jewish parents who'd been, both of his parents have been Jewish for generations, going back to Sinai probably. And one grew up not celebrating Christmas, and one grew up, having, not celebrating Christmas per se, but having a tree and having, eggnog and candy canes and stuff like that. And this was a Jewish person, right? So even within Jewish families, where both parents are Jewish, this can be an issue. All the more so in families where one parent is Jewish and one parent isn't, and has a strong connection to those holidays. And this is a long answer, so I'm again going to go back to the rocket fuel here. What I often counsel families to do is, again, approach it with mutual respect. This especially comes into play when it comes to grandparents. Let's say if you have living grandparents, many couples can say, okay, we can agree that we're going to observe Hanukkah at home, and we're not going to have a tree, even though there's kind of an argument. Well, Christmas with a tree and all, eggnog and candy canes and all that stuff has nothing to do with Jesus and Christianity, etc. That, again, that's kind of a gray area. But it really comes into play when it comes to grandparents. So let's say we agree to have a menorah at home and celebrate Hanukkah at home and not Christmas in the home. But how do we hang out with the grandparents at this time of year, especially the grandparents who have a Christmas tree and stockings and the whole bit, and even maybe go to Mass or church services? And so what I like to throw in there into the mix is one of the top 10, right? I don't know if anybody ever sees this. I have this thing up here on my mantle that says, the Ten Commandments are not multiple choice. I don't know if you see that, but just so you do, one of the top 10, kibud av v'em, right? Honor your father and your mother. Be in awe of your mother and your father, as it's restated in Deuteronomy. So it's possible to have, a Jewish family and a Jewish household where, one Jewish spouse and one not Jewish spouse, and maybe not necessarily have Christmas in the household, but then go to the grandparents while the grandparents are celebrating Christmas, right? This was a part of my family, in my first marriage. When we went to visit the grandparents, my parents were celebrating Christmas, but we didn't celebrate Christmas in the house. In my current marriage, my current family, again, we don't have a tree, we don't do Christmassy stuff in the house. But but my children in this marriage have no Jewish grandparents. And so whether we go to Texas to my parents' house or to Wisconsin to my wife's family's house, there's Christmas trees, there's stockings, there's all this stuff. And so my kids have this secure identity of we're Jewish, we celebrate Jewish holidays at home. Some of our family is not Jewish. And when we are with them, we celebrate the holidays that they celebrate, or rather, we're present at these celebrations, and we can rejoice with them without necessarily worshiping in the religion that they worship in, right? We can be present with our families. We can be present and joyful and honor our grandparents without necessarily being a part of that religion. Now, that takes some cooperation on the part of the non-Jewish grandparents, right? The parents need to have a conversation with the grandparents to say, okay, this is how we're raising our kids. We're going to bring them over to celebrate with you, and you get to, spend time with them in the context of the holiday that you celebrate. Just please respect that this is maybe not necessarily our family's thing, but we're doing this with you, and that's fine. Because I say, like, look, if you go to the grandparents' house, you celebrate their holiday with them, and you enjoy it, you enjoy the time together, you enjoy the season without necessarily being adherents of the religion that they are adherents to, you are still exhibiting that Jewish value of kibud av v'em, of respecting the grandparents. And so I think it is possible for an interfaith family to get through December. Now, when it comes to a couple where one feels very strongly about celebrating Christmas and one feels very strongly about not celebrating Christmas, about, Davka celebrating Hanukkah, then that's a different conversation. That's a conversation for the couple to have and say, okay, are we raising our kids as both Jewish and Christian? That can be a hard thing to do. And I'm just going to throw this out here. This is not going to be a fun or easy answer for a lot of people. I think it's possible for two people who adhere to different faiths, adhere to different truth claims of religion. It's hard to raise kids as both, in the sense of giving them half of one and half of another thing, because then they don't really grow up feeling the full measure of both. Furthermore, the kids are in a position of feeling like they have to choose between one or the other. And it's not just about choosing one religion or another, it's effectively putting them in the position of choosing between one parent and another. Like, if I feel more Jewish, then I'm in effect choosing my Jewish parent and rejecting my non-Jewish parent, or vice versa. So I think when it's possible, and this is the case in the majority of the, say, intermarried families that I've worked with, where there's somebody who feels strongly about being Jewish, and then there's a spouse who doesn't want to be Jewish but doesn't feel strongly in another way. And so the default becomes Jewish holidays in families where each partner feels strongly about a different religion. That can pull the kids in a couple of different directions. And that's hard. But I'm not going to say it never happens. And I'm not going to say you're doing it wrong as parents. I have all respect for parents in the world. That is the hardest job that I know from personal experience. And when parents have different values in certain areas, that can be really challenging to negotiate, but that's the gig. And so I feel like as long as you approach that with mutual respect, as long as you approach that with openness to mutual learning, then that's something that each family can negotiate on their own. My role as a rabbi is to say, okay, here's what the Jewish tradition has to offer, including that commandment for the children in your family to honor each of their parents. And each family has to kind of negotiate that for themselves. I'm sorry it's not an easy answer, but it's a real answer. And so I would advise parents who, each of whom feels strongly about a different religion, to take a look at how the kids are being raised, or how the kids feel like they have a full measure of access to each of those paths, rather than a half measure of each of those paths, and God forbid are being pulled in one direction or another in a way that makes the kids feel like they have to choose between their parents, because no kid should be put in that position. So I'm going to jump into the chat here real quick. Kathy says, my former Jewish mother-in-law wanted to have all the holidays, even Christian ones, at her house. She wasn't very good at sharing. I'm just going to say that sounds like more like a mother-in-law issue than an interreligious issue, if I can be so bold as to say that. Mother-in-laws, father-in-laws, in-laws, I'm not going to gender stereotype. The in-law dynamic can be at least as complicated as the interreligious dynamic. I'm not saying that to be dismissive, but I am saying that to sort of separate the interpersonal dynamics of families from interreligious dynamics of families. Ruthie says, this is a little off topic, but very personal. My children have been very active in learning with me and going to the synagogue, celebrating holidays, etc. That's fantastic. And so what I advise people to do when they have little kids and they want to raise their kids in a certain tradition is not just tell the kids to do things, but show the kids you doing things. Show the kids how you get what you get out of the religion and why you love it. Because I think that's the most effective way of passing a religious tradition onto one's children. I tell this story all the time of the Kotzker Rabbi, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, which is like a little town in what was at different times Poland. The map moves around a little bit over the last century or two, where a man came up to the Kotzker Rebbe and said, I can't get my son to study Torah. No matter how much I tell him to study Torah, he won't do it. And the Kotzker Rebbe sort of boxes him on the ear and says, Tepesh, you fool. Telling your son to study Torah won't make him study Torah, right? If you tell him to study Torah, then all he's learning is how to tell his son to study Torah. And then his son will tell his son to study Torah. And your legacy is multiple generations of people telling each other what to do, and nobody's actually doing any studying. If you want your son to study Torah, for example, you study Torah. And let your son see that you love doing that, and that is what's going to make him study Torah. And so, again, that goes for holidays. I'll just go out on a limb and say whichever tradition you're following, whichever religion you're following, show the kids what you love and why you love it. Let them see you enjoying it, and that's when they're really going to get invested, right? That's when they're going to try it on themselves, for example. And so, Ruthie, I think it's great that you're involving kids in things, and just make sure that it's not just about carpooling. It's not just the chauffeur service. Make sure they see you enjoying these things as well if you want them to take it seriously. Let's see. Val says, my son as well, Ruthie, my hubby is secular humanist and is happy to let me teach my traditions. And so I think, I'm just going to say, this is the majority of, I'll say, interfaith families that I see. For a long time, especially in the conservative movement, we were worried about these two faith families where one parent was strongly Jewish and one parent was strongly something else. However, anecdotally, most of my experience has been seeing families where one family felt strongly about passing on Jewish traditions, or one parent rather felt strongly about passing on Jewish traditions, and one parent didn't feel Jewish but didn't really feel strongly something else. And I feel like as long as that other parent can be supportive, or at least, open to it, or at least not actively opposed to it, I think you can have a very happy Jewish family in that context. Or rather, let me just say, a very happy family in that context, with kids who are given a rich background in Judaism from which to draw on. As Val says, it depends on the tradition you want to convert into. My local Reform and Reconstructionist traditions do not require Brit Milah. They can do Brit Shalom. And so that's a topic for another video, I'll say, about Brit and other things that are required for a conversion. So listen, this is a controversial topic. I really appreciate people hanging in there with me. I've shared a lot of personal stuff about my own journey in multiple families, I'll say, with multiple sets of grandparents. But that's real life, y'all. And those are the families that I work with today, of having, complicated origin stories, and then falling in love. We'll say, in addition to or despite of these various differences, and then negotiating what that family looks like given different sources or different origins, that love that brought them together, the love that they then share with the world by having children, and then passing their traditions on to their children. And I'll just close by saying, the more we can be open, the more we can be open with mutual respect, mutual regard, and go the extra mile with a commitment to mutual learning about each other's traditions, and just having frank, honest conversations with one another about what is best for the children. One more thing that I want to add to that, just because it has come up a lot in my family and in all other families that I've dealt with vis-a-vis conversion. Let's say somebody grows up with Christmas, becomes Jewish, has kids, and then has this kind of longing or this itch or what have you, like, okay, I have kids now. I want to give my kids the same kind of happy childhood that I had, and my happy childhood included Christmas. And so this was part of my story as well. Like, I grew up having great memories of Christmas, and then I had Jewish kids. And that's when we sort of remember our childhoods and remember all the things that were good about them, and maybe forget some of the things that were bad about them. But then we say, okay, how do I pass on that joy of childhood to my kids without passing on this most joyful thing of celebrating Christmas? And then I realized with my Jewish children that they were experiencing the same level of joy, let's say, with Hanukkah. Like, they didn't miss growing up with Christmas the way I thought they might, because that was something that I loved from my childhood. And I see families deal with this all the time, where somebody says, okay, part of my joy was, part of my joy in my childhood was going down, seeing the tree there, opening the stockings, opening the presents and stuff. And then I say to these families, okay, well, maybe that's not something you pass on to your child, but just understand that the kids have just as much joy when it comes to lighting the Hanukkah candles, opening Hanukkah presents, or other holidays and things like that. You're not robbing them of a joy that they never experienced. They have a new kind of joy that you haven't had the experience with. And so now you get to see them have that same childlike joy lived through Jewish traditions, and just be open to the idea that they're not necessarily feeling they're missing anything. And so that's something that I've experienced. That's something that I share with families that I work with. And so I'll pass that on to you, Hero, as well. So let's see what other questions we have before we go. We covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate people hanging out with me this evening to ask these frank questions in this very controversial topic. But it's important to me to pass on what I've learned, what I've experienced myself, what I've learned from working with other families, that it is possible to have a happy Jewish family in the context of a marriage and a relationship where one partner is Jewish, one partner is not, as long as we have mutual respect, a commitment to curiosity and learning about each other's backgrounds, and the openness to new kinds of joy, new kinds of wonder that maybe you haven't experienced before. So thank you so much for doing this learning with me tonight. I really appreciate everybody bringing their honest questions, and I hope my answers have been helpful for people. And I'll just say, until next time, heroes, peace.